On today's episode of Poor Time Management, we keep working on this thing. Well, here's the mandatory stagnation period where we do nothing on the old Trail 70. This is aged for about 6 months. Time to shake the dust off and maybe start working on this again. Now, as usual, the motivation is not so much to get this done as it is to get it out of the way, because there is not enough room to fit a sled from here over to there. Well, this is good. I've forgotten everything I learned when I took it apart, so we'll have to start fresh. Well, I know that there was something going on with the first gear, so being on the shifter side, we're going to start ripping into this thing and just kind of see where we get from there. I got the old fancy JIS screwdriver, but it's not quite doing the job of getting these stubborn screws out. So I kind of need the good old hammer impact, which I found is actually out on loan at the moment. Screw that. We're going to go back to the old hammer method with the wrong tools. So we got the other side cover off and still haven't quite figured out how to get this all apart yet. I'm going to have to watch some instructional videos or something. I believe we found the problem with the shifter. If you look closely, that's the little rider arm that's supposed to go on the detents for the shift drum. And you can see it's broken. And actually, the more I'm looking at stuff, I don't think that's supposed to be like that either. Nothing a little bit of JB Weld can't handle. That, however, is going to take a little bit more. Off to the interwebs to figure out how to properly disassemble one of these. Somebody's definitely been in here before with the amount of blue silicone that's everywhere. Makes you wonder on these old motors how many times they've actually been apart and rebuilt. This is an oversized piston. Well, we finally got back into tearing this apart. Part of the problem was I knew there were some pretty serious issues going on inside, so procrastination was going to make it better. And I also needed a clutch tool, so what better way than just wait it out. But once we got that all apart, there's the problem.
Here's your problem.
The little detent lever here for the shifter arm has broken clean out of there. Now, this isn't exactly going to be a 5-minute repair. This is a fairly heavy spring that keeps that detent wheel onto the star. So in order for this thing to have some pretty firm shifts and stay in gear right, we're going to have a pretty comparable spring force to keep this thing located. Now, I know you're saying this case is shot, just go on the old Evil Bay and buy another one. Well, I ain't paying for that just yet. We got to come up with an alternate solution. Because the only thing worse than that missing piece right there would be the piece missing out of my wallet. So first thought was to just try and re-bolt something through there to get that arm. However, we need to maintain the space across here for that spring to sit in. And the distance that this arm sits at is pretty important. So, the solution? Piece of old scrap iron. I think this might have came off a bed frame, which, you know, those are a good alloy steel, so this ain't no hack job. And we're going to whittle this thing down and kind of fit it in there, back into that little pocket. And find a tall nut or a boss or just some steel to weld on to here. We'll tap some threads through it, and that'll be good as used. See what the oil filter looks like. Huh. It's like brand new. I think the bearings are supposed to do that. So we got some cardboard aided design going here. It does not get any more precision than that. Sort of like that. So the plan is drill a couple of holes on this side and then just put some through bolts through the outside of the case. You can seal that up pretty easy with silicone. Now we have run into a slight problem.
Yo, I'll solve it.
The base for the arm here is about that far off the center line. When you try and put that in there on the center line, the arm interferes with the back half. And for that matter, so is the spring when it's on there. So we're going to have to make a performance notch right around there. So the more we keep working on this, the more involved this little bracket becomes. You know, sometimes you think it's just going to be a simple piece, and then you have to start cutting and grinding and filing and drilling and tapping, and before you know it, you got like 8 hours in it. So we're going to take this bracket here, which has been ground out strategically to clear the spring. We're going to weld this nut in place after we tap this to the same threads as the nut. Yeah, that's totally drilled to the right size. Well, we seem to have encountered a slight problem. We're using this through bolt to hold the nut in place so we can tack weld it there and keep everything lined up. However, our CNC thread tapping machine did not quite get that bolt through there perpendicular, shooting off at an angle. And that's going to be a problem when we try and throw in this bolt and when it's sitting over that way. Now in this case, luckily, you can convert your thread class here from a 2B to a -1B, jam a paper clip in there on the correct side, and it'll kind of, work its way back over. But this is just all set up. This is going to get welded permanent. Now this type of breakage is one of those problems where you try and think about alternate ways to provide a solution, not necessarily to fix what broke. Because fixing what broke would be like trying to weld that little bung of aluminum back on there. And since aluminum welds are never going to be as strong as the original casting, it wouldn't be a long-term solution. So that's time to start thinking outside the box. We need to provide a pivot point here, and what do we have to work with? We've got a back wall ribbed down here, a little bit of a backing plate, what's left of it. But the biggest advantage is space, and that will allow you to put something different in there. In this case, a piece of angle iron that we can bolt in, kind of fill in some of the voids and use it as a support and base for the new post. Because you could totally take this thing apart and try and clean this all up and weld it back together, and it would work, but there's a good chance it would break. An option like this allows you to use just brute force steel, which is stronger than aluminum, and we're able to use a bit more of it and kind of fit things in there, not the way they were originally intended. So as long as we can kind of spread out our attachment points and not break this aluminum, this little bracket here should hold up for quite a long time. Alright, so after lots of grinding, drilling, and further modifying, I think the bracket is pretty much done. We ground off the high spots of the aluminum there, and then this little bracket is ready to go in. Now we just got to transfer over the spots to drill, use some mystery cap screws from the junk drawer, and start bolting this thing back together. We used a high precision Sharpie marker to map out the locations. starting to come together now. So for the return spring, we were running out of real estate horizontally here for the thickness of this spring. So we chopped out one of the coils and made it thinner, and then realized in the process we basically increased the spring rate. So this is going to be a harder spring on the star wheel. So we're going to have to adjust and kind of bend that thing there to get a happy medium and hold just enough pressure on the shifter drum. Because that wasn't a mistake, that's a design enhancement. So we're currently on the 87th mock-up of this setup, and as you can see there's spring tension on the arm, but it's not on the drum star wheel. That's because all the way in the back right there we're getting some negative clearance. So we're gonna have to take this apart again, do some more grinding, and make sure everything moves freely before we do the final assembly. Alright, this is it. Final time going together. Probably not. So we got one of the gears back on and just some slight negative clearance. It's going to be a tough call whether to just grind down the backside of this gear or take everything apart again and grind down the head of that bolt. Well, it's not like we have Loctite on there or anything. Well, this is great. We're at the point where we have to start reassembling everything, but it's been so long that I don't really remember what goes where. Time to play What's That Bolt? Now there is the question of how many of those gaskets are we actually going to use to replace stuff. We gotta do our part to create random packs of gaskets that only have one or two missing out of them. Rationalizing. That center gasket was fine beforehand, and it's only been taken apart, you know, like 40 times when this whole case was moving around, so it should still be perfect. You can't say that we're slacking on this build. We're even keeping some of the grunge out of the crankcase. We're throwing in some of the easy to replace seals. Might as well. Things are getting slightly more challenging than anticipated. I thought we were pretty much home free once the bottom end was all buttoned up and we just had to throw the piston in the cylinder. This 4-stroke crap. All these valves and stuff. Now I guess we have to go through and put new seals in, check the valves, you know, maybe lap them back in better. Oh geez, and I guess there's like top dead center and all that jazz. Ain't nobody got time for that. If this was a 2-stroke, we'd have been out burning dirt by now. These gaskets had to be on round 2 or 3 of reuse with all this compound layers of silicone. So we're milling the intakes and stuff flat again with our milling machine. So just going through and lapping the valves in. The seats really didn't look in that bad of shape, but might as well while we're here. Just drop the valve through and then jam the piece of fuel line onto the valve stem. That way you could twist it and run that seat in. Now I got these metal grinding compounds for doing the valve lapping, but these were cheap and they're good to have because you never know when you got to work a couple of pieces in together. You can use it for more than just valve lapping. All the parts certainly have some wear to them, but if I learned anything from watching some of the Tom Martin's old videos, these Hondas will pretty much run on just about anything. I mean, this isn't a performance engine, so there's no real good reason why you'd have to port out any of this exhaust. Man, you would swear that there's an easier way to get these little retaining clips in there. I mean, I'm using the proper tools. And of course the gaskets ain't fitting, so we had to modify this one already. We got them brand new rings on there. Only the top quality of generic aftermarket. Didn't quite measure up the piston clearance because, well, we weren't changing it anyways. So we threw this thing together, and luckily the bolt pattern only goes on one way. And after putting it all to this point, realized that the chain probably skipped and we're not really at top dead center when the gear should be timed. We got lucky and the thing never skipped, I think. So we'll see if it runs. Of course, the gasket set doesn't give you all the gaskets, so we're back to cutting them. So we just hand torque those down and kind of rolling it over a little bit, and I don't think that's good. So we're going to try and not bend that valve and then figure out where we went wrong. Well, I'll tell you where we went wrong. It's a 4-stroke. Well, if only there was a place you could find timing specs or something like this. But we're going to put the crank at top dead center and then get this dot to the notch, and maybe that'll do it. One more step closer. One more step closer to falling on the floor. We might actually look up the torque specs for those eventually, but for now it's snugged up pretty close. The old Fouch spark plug is, well, it's keeping debris out. And that's about all we're going to put on for now until we throw this thing back into the frame. Probably ought to set the valve clearance. Now the seat is in mint condition, so we're going to keep most of the upholstery intact. However, the factory Honda board, you know, the old billet pine had cracked there and wasn't giving us the support we needed from side to side. So we just kind of added in this center spacer here that fits nice and tight down in there between the frame. Solid as a rock. I mean, with the price of lumber these days, really couldn't afford to replace that. Might actually be time to check the bearings and some of the other driveline parts. I mean, there's play in the forks, and you know, there's a couple of new nuts and some hardware on here that makes me suspicious that it was torn apart but never really fixed. There's got to be a joke in there somewhere about that gas tank. Well, there's probably a proper method to get that axle bolt out of there, but we didn't have time. Didn't want to pay for the free manual online, so we just kind of struggled for a bit. Valve stem's not going in quite the way it should, so we're probably going to air this down and see if we can kind of move it back to correctish, because I don't really feel like buying a new tube for it. You know what? On second thought, the valve stem won't come out, so I think it's fine. We're not actually buying new bearings. We're just injecting some oil underneath the lip seal there to give them some more life. Because these are probably good made in Japan bearings. Now, unsurprisingly, the brakes weren't functioning. However, I am a bit surprised at how good of condition the shoes look to be in. I mean, there's actually quite a bit of friction material there. They actually do kind of work. So upon further inspection of these forks, these aluminum bushing part retainers, they do not look like they're going to come out of there. So we just dumped some oil down here, kind of working it around, and we'll let that steel on steel contact keep working with some proper lubrication. I mean, that counts as changing the fork oil, right? You don't need metric. And it's pretty crazy, but there's something resembling grease in those bearings. Not going to worry about that rust dust. That's an aluminum corrosion inhibitor. That's an acceptable amount of play for the sprocket. That circlip is worn thinner than my budget for this project. Might have to do something about that. Sure, that's fine. Gotta remember to not park it on that spot. We'll have to see if that's within factory spec. Well, this regular ball bearing is now a spherical bearing. There is a time when you just have to buy new bearings. Out looking for parts. Gotta be a lever here somewhere. It sort of fits. So it's not correct, but it is off a Yamaha. We're gonna see if we can't make some cables or pieces work. Did the right thing. Got the new bearing in there. They're fresh out of China. And we were gonna replace the circlip until we found that we didn't have any. So we just kind of flipped it over, get a little bit more life out of it. Now when you stand here and try and line this up, the tail light, the fender, all the way up through the whole forks and the triple trees, nothing's in a straight line. I mean, those bolts are redundant anyways. Better than before. We doubled up on the layers of good 3M electrical tape. That's probably tight enough. Now I just hope nobody ever tries to remove those nuts. Starting to look like a bike again. It is slightly shameful that I've got that brand new shiny hardware on there. We replaced some of the stuff so far with more period correct. Perfect. Now don't worry, that's not a permanent fix. We're going to replace it with a real coat hanger. And I just realized this thing has two different size tires. Yeah, the chain definitely looks newer than some of the sprockets. We're almost out of adjustment, so it's good enough. Spark check. So the carburetor, with that bent flange, we're going to have to machine this flat. Nah, that's a little bit too aggressive. This from the file cabinet should do. And second thought. That's beautiful. I mean, it's not perfect, but that's what the O-ring's for. Yep, and we definitely drilled out that to fit some 1/4-inch bolts. I mean, you gotta have something non-metric on here. Put a bunch of weld on there. That ought to give a few more decades of wear. Also did the same thing on the foot pegs. That way they sit a little bit more positive camber. So, took a while to get here from Japan, but we did get a new muffler bracket. Rear brake is adjusted. As good as it's gonna get. I think this is how the Kickstarter goes, but well, good enough. Just got to get that throttle cable now. Putting in some oil probably wouldn't hurt either. Almost forgot about the steering. Probably shouldn't be able to turn that much, so got to weld that. Well, we got to make and then weld a steering stop in there. This is getting out of hand now. We're into this throttle thing here. It should have a thumb throttle because what's these twist grips? But we wouldn't have even been messing with it if it wasn't for the fact that the throttle is like got 2 strands left actually working it. Well, this whole throttle cable thing really escalated quickly. I'm left with a bag of broken parts and I need a new throttle cable. All these years of working on stuff, I've never had one of these twist throttles apart. Learn something new every day. Finally got a new throttle cable in the mail. The problem was, it wasn't a whole lot more to get the entire kit with a carburetor than it was to just buy that cable. Because apparently it's a little bit of an odd cable with the way the ends are set up. So this actually looks really similar to the one that's on there. Don't think that the other carb is anywhere near original. So taking off one piece of Chinese junk and putting a fresh one on. It's kind of too shiny though. I don't really like that look. But it allows the use of the old throttle assembly. You know, I also did kind of look into buying a whole aftermarket thing that just slides on there, but you know, this matches the look of the bike better. Time once again to play Where's That Part Go? Once you take it apart like 5 times, then you figure it out. Well, upon further review, I guess this is a key-in. We'll see how that old Chinese carb does. May end up having to put this one back on, even though it's pretty well wore out. The original slide has a lot of wear on it, and so does the corresponding area on the inside of the carb body. And it also looks like the needle jet down there has a bit of an oval shape to it. So that's likely worn out of spec and getting too much fuel in the mid-range. I have a feeling this thing was run for a good long time with very poor air filtration. It would make sense that a lot of dust coming through here, wearing out the internals of the carburetor, burning out the rings in the motor. It didn't have a filter on it when I got it. This is definitely one of those projects that had a lot of starts and stops to it. The motor was sitting in pieces on the workbench, next to the workbench, underneath the workbench for seemed like months. Eventually, a few parts rolled in, and we got back motivation to start wrenching again. There is the finished product. Now I say finished, but we haven't started it yet, so that bracket has caught me in the knee just one too many times. It's a little bit better. That's still off the lawnmower. Time to switch this thing on. And if I remember right, we put a fuel filter in there? Oh well. Here goes nothing. Maybe it's flooded. I think we managed to break the throttle already. Hardly even smoking. problem is I can't shut it off because the key's broken. Well, alright, some problems solve themselves. Now I was going to provide a fixed solution for this kill switch, but kind of forgot about it. We're just going to provide a semi-permanent screwdriver. Providing a solution to a problem is just as good as fixing it. There is one problem that's going to keep us from riding it too much. If you can hear that, the tube has pretty much split itself in half, so the front tire will not hold basically any air. One more part for the order list, but other than that, this thing's pretty much ready to ride. That still ain't right. First gear keeps hopping in and out. Not gonna lie, pretty disappointed at this stage. Did a lot of work to that motor, thought we'd found the problem, fixed it, assuming that everything else was fine since there was a pretty blatantly broken part in there that would make sense as to why it wouldn't stay in gear. Went through everything, did all that, only to find out you still have the same problem. Now, I do not have the current motivation to tear that motor back out and go through that all again. It's going to have to sit and wait for another day. Sometimes that's how she goes.